Hi, everybody, and welcome to this episode of Now and Men, the podcast about men, masculinities, and gender equality. So, how can we introduce today's guest, Raewyn Connell? Believe me, it's not easy. For those of us working in the area of men and masculinities, she's something of a household name.
Indeed, she's one of the founders of this research field, and her 1995 book, Masculinities, is almost certainly the key text in this area. While she's been best known internationally for her studies on masculinity, she's also written and researched widely on issues such as gender and sexuality, education, class, neoliberalism, Southern theory, and the politics of intellectual life. Now, Raewyn officially retired, in inverted commas, in 2014 after a long and illustrious career, but she continues to do a range of fascinating work, and she's now Professor Emerita at the University of Sydney. Happily, her hugely influential oeuvre has recently been recognised by the International Sociological Association Award for Excellence in Research and Practice, which is awarded by peers and is only given every 4 years, I believe.
Yeah, so congratulations on that very well-deserved award, Raewyn. So we're speaking to you at home today in Sydney, and so it's the evening for Raewyn, but early morning for us. So thank you so much for taking the time out of your schedule to speak to us, Raewyn.
Well, I'm glad to be here. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Well, we're really, really grateful and delighted that you accepted our invitation to come on the podcast. Yeah, and so obviously in the last few years, we've all been through the most kind of appalling upheaval, I suppose, as a result of COVID-19. And I suppose we could talk for an hour just about that. But of course, now overlaid on top of that, currently, is Russia's horrendous invasion of Ukraine. And I know that during the pandemic, you wrote a kind of self-isolation diary about your kind of experiences during the pandemic. And in that, you mentioned an important book which you read called Boys in Zinc by Svetlana Alexievich, which provides kind of harrowing grassroots testimonies of the Soviet war in Afghanistan from 1979 to 1989. So we were just wondering if you might like to say something about that and about the connections between masculinity and war, which perhaps that book highlights. And are there any echoes there with what's happening currently in Ukraine?
Sure. I'm quite sure that story of Russian involvement in Afghanistan, and indeed Svetlana's book, is in the minds of many people in Russia at the moment. It's really quite remarkable and inspiring to see the public opposition to what the regime is doing, which is obviously not an easy thing to do in contemporary Russia. I've been thinking about that a lot, and as in thinking about a number of other political problems, issues of masculinity, do surface. But I want to sort of warn against one easy way of doing that, which is to look at the guy who's the figurehead, that is Vladimir Putin, and start imputing certain patterns of masculinity to him as a kind of individual, and see him, for instance, as an exemplar of toxic masculinity, whatever that means, and then attribute the thing to a malevolent kind of masculinity. Now, I want to emphasize that in understanding a situation like this, you've got to look beyond prominent individuals. You've got to think about the institutions that are involved. You've got to think about the economic forces that are in play. If you want to think about Putin, you've got to think about his background in the secret police, then in the chaos of the time after the death of the Soviet Union, the process of state building, which he and others were involved in, and then, of course, his, surfacing at the top of the heap, building up power, building up an alliance among the Russian billionaires, and putting down various oppositions. There is an authoritarian political practice there, and undoubtedly there is a masculinized culture of politics in the country, but also a masculinized culture of economic power, and in the military too. And there is a literature on this, not necessarily specifically about Russia, but about the role of masculinity cultures of masculinity, certain kinds of practices emphasizing masculinity, how important they have been in the history of armies, of military forces, military decision-making, the turbulence that's created in contemporary military forces with equal opportunity regimes coming in, not in Russia particularly, but in other cases. So there's all of that kind of background that we also have to recognise and bring into our thinking, as well as the particular leadership. Similarly, I mean, if we're thinking about politics in our own countries. In Britain, one can, people do public psychoanalyses of Johnson, but that doesn't really help in understanding how you've got a regime like that. Or in Australia, the conservative, equally conservative regime that we've got here, which has a rather different public style, but very similar kinds of policies and economic backing. So all of that has to be part of the picture, I guess. And yet it's, I totally understand the visceral horror that so many people feel, understandably feel, in the face of what is fairly patently an unprovoked military onslaught that serves the interests of at least the ruling clique in the dominant military power in the region. Now, of course, Russia is not the only country that's done this at all, but it's the one that's front and centre at the moment, for sure.
I suppose some of the things you were saying there about who's in government currently, how that came to be, also does feel quite relevant during the pandemic. Perhaps those kinds of the way that government is run in certain countries might have influenced responses to COVID as well, and perhaps again elements of masculinity are influencing that as well. Maybe. Did you want to say anything about that? About how you feel?
Yeah, there is something there. It was often said, particularly in the first year of the pandemic, that countries with women in the political leadership, like Aotearoa, New Zealand, with Jacinta Ardern, or Germany at the time, were actually doing better in controlling the pandemic than countries with a masculine leadership. Whether that would still be the case, I don't know. Things have maybe evened out a bit over time. But again, there are so many things influencing the rates of infection, rates of hospitalisation, and so forth in different countries. You can't place very much weight on a single issue. But there are a lot of ways in which the pandemic is gendered. The death rates, for instance, for men are actually higher than for women. Why that should be so is debated by the medicos, whether it's to do with practices like smoking that have historically been more common among men than among women, at least among the older generations of men. Persistent alcohol abuse. They may be part of the explanation. There may be some physiological differences that affect it too, but it is a feature. But more important than that is the gender divisions in the health workforce, where I think the global figure is that something like 70% of the health workforce are women. But in the professions which have most power, most determination over health policy, the ratio is the other way around, and that's a much higher proportion of men among doctors and among health administrators, all of that. What has struck me and disturbed me, I guess, as I've followed the pandemic and the social responses to it, is how the peculiar way in which it's been politicised, especially in the United States, but also in other countries as well, where the pandemic, or more exactly the responses to the pandemic, have become mixed up with the assertion of certain kinds of right-wing political culture, which themselves are very powerfully masculinized. Even if the voting base has a very large number of women in it, nevertheless, the leadership and the political style often emphasizes familiar themes, dominant forms of masculinity, toughness, risk-taking. There have been, political controversies and campaigns in which public health measures have been presented as a sign of weakness, of not being a real man. If you wear a mask, or if, as the governor or the president or the prime minister, you push for public health measures, this is seen as a sign of either being a control freak and a totalitarian, or not a proper man. And so it is a confused scene in some ways, but that has become a powerful thematization of the pandemic, where public health measures themselves are coded as weakness, as feminine, and you see some consequences of that, including patterns of death. In our particular version of all that in Australia, where the extremely vocal far right is not as powerful as it is in the United States, we've nevertheless, have a regime which is simply not committed to an ethic of care or a sense of public responsibility, government responsibility for issues like healthcare of the elderly. Even when it's their constitutional responsibility, you have a kind of washing of hands, a Pontius Pilate kind of a response to what has been a really quite terrifying rate of death from COVID-19 in old people's homes, which follows from an agenda of privatisation, of retreat, of the welfare state, the whole business of the celebration of the inventive and hard-nosed entrepreneur, so that more and more of health services have been handed over to profit-making institutions, and they cut their labour costs by reducing the average qualifications of the workforce, and by hiring casualised and often, massively overworked care workers. It's not surprising that you have the kind of consequences that we've seen.
You've mentioned a range of very important themes there, Raewyn, but we wanted to talk in a minute about your earlier
Sure.
book, Masculinities. But before we do, could we explore some of the work before that as well, which provided the building blocks, if you like, for that book? I mean, you were very involved in empirical work in high schools in the late 70s. You researched pupils' experiences of school life, teachers' practices, family strategies, different strategies, trajectories growing up. And that became the authored book, Making the Difference, in 1982. Which, as I understand it, was really about analysing and responding to class, to gender inequalities in education. But it feels, and this is going back to what you were just saying, really, that you identified a range of issues then, which are all still highly relevant, but the policy agenda has gone backwards since neoliberalism took hold. Would you say that's a fair...
Well, that's a fair summary, yeah. Putting it in a nutshell, I couldn't improve on your nutshell. It has. We were, I guess, that was an absolutely fascinating research project that you're mentioning. It's one of the research projects that I've thought about, for a very long time since, and I'm still still reflecting on, I guess. And I had a really terrific experience with the small research group who did that study and wrote it up. We were, launching out with a fairly conventional research problem at the start. How are social inequalities in education produced and maintained over time? We did that by interviewing 14 or 15-year-olds in two kinds of schools, mainstream working class public schools and elite private schools, the schools that the children of the ruling class were sent to. And we didn't just interview the kids, we also interviewed their teachers, and we also interviewed their parents and went and interviewed the parents in their homes. So it was not just if you like, a bit of school ethnography, but ethnography around the school as well. It was an absolutely fascinating project. And that, automatically brought us into areas like how class differences relate to gender patterns. If we're visiting homes and seeing gender divisions of labour in the home, who in the family is engaging with the school, who's not, what different expectations the school are, what the teachers are making of the situation of the kids, what different teachers are understanding their educational task, and so forth. Now, all of that linked to class and to the different, quite strikingly different educational outcomes for kids of wealthy families on one hand, mainstream working class families on the other. But it also, every aspect of it seemed also to be connected with gender, with divisions of labour between the parents, divisions of labour between different groups of teachers, so that you tended to get more men teaching in areas like mathematics or metal work and technical skills and so forth. You tended to get more women in areas like drama, like English studies, domestic skills. You could see this playing out in the school, and you also had sort of hierarchies. But the thing that was, if you like, most dramatic and most powerfully influenced my later thinking was what we saw among the kids. The way they were negotiating class and gender and even ethnicity and geographical location in their lives, inside and outside the school. And it was there that we saw, something that has remained as an important issue for me ever since, the presence of different patterns of masculinity and femininity in the same social group, in the same social setting. You had these variations in gender practices, in the ways kids related to each other, the way they asserted themselves or didn't, their expectations for the future, the kinds of careers or lives they might be looking for. And that was actually where the idea of hegemonic masculinity first crystallized. As you know, in one of the reports we wrote from that project, which was called Using Good Australian Language, the report was called Ockers and Discomaniacs, which was a phrase used by by a witty teacher to describe the kids in the class. And I don't quite know how to translate ochre into English.
I can tell you, I looked it up, Raewyn.
Oh, yes? Tell me.
I looked it up, and it said a word for rough, uncouth Australian men.
There you go.
So there you go. So
not too bad.
And I believe in that report you also contrasted the ochres with the Cyrils. Is
yes.
that right?
Yes.
The Cyrils were effectively the Scots.
Well, we didn't exactly. No, the Cyrils actually came became visible in a different school, different context. So that wasn't quite a direct contrast. The contrast we saw in the same school, this was one of the ruling class schools, was the Cyrils versus the Bloods. And I think you understand what the Bloods were in the context of the ruling class school. I mean, you've got one of those prime minister now. You understand the style. And these were the lads who were doing well on the party scene, quite likely to be in the first 15 football team. They weren't stupid. I mean, they weren't failing in the exams. No one in those schools would be failing in exams. That was part of the deal that the school offered to the parents, that they would get them through. And if they wanted to go to university, they would. But it was what was interesting was the reputation of the school, the capacity to offer that service to ruling class parents depended on their doing really well in the competitive exams at matriculation level. So they needed not only the Bloods, but they needed the SWATs. And the slang term for those in that particular school was the Cyrils, who, according to the stereotype, wore round glasses and would never be seen on a football field, and were from time to time bullied by the Bloods. But of course, that was bad for the school. If that happened and they drove the Cyrils away, the school's average results in the competitive exams at the end of the high school year would fall, and the school's economic interests would be damaged, and their cultural position would be damaged. The school needed both, and it was we had really interesting discussions with some of the teachers who were responsible for that particular year about how they negotiated this tension and sort of held the Bloods back a bit without actually frightening them off or turning the school into a Cyrils only kind of production. It was absolutely fascinating. So you have an interplay between the teachers and the kids, interplay among the kids. All of this in the context, of course, the parents, many of them in this kind of school, had been to either the same school or the same kind of school before. So the fathers had their agenda for the kind of masculinity that the boys would be. So there's this, fascinating, multi-sided politics of masculinity going on in and around the lives of this cohort of kids. That was a wonderful model for seeing what could happen in the gender dynamics, in the gender politics of everyday life.
Mm.
And, you can't read off those categories to any other situation. You always have to ask, what are the actual masculinities or femininities at work in a particular situation? But that was illuminating enough, I think, that it sent me off to think, more conceptually about how we could understand multiple masculinities, the presence in the same group or in the same situation, different patterns, different ways of being a boy or a man, and what the consequences of those were. And that was the launch point, or about the launch point for my thinking when I came to construct a research project specifically about masculinities and begin to collect life histories of men, their sort of retrospective stories of their education, their family life, but also their adulthood, and begin to see patterns in the differences among them and think about the way those patterns of difference might work.
Yeah, that sounds such a fascinating project, and I'm just thinking back, on one of the earlier episodes, we interviewed Mike Ward, who's done some work in schools in South Wales,
Mm-hmm.
and it has echoes of the work that you did, but he said with his work, he didn't reckon he could do it today. He wouldn't get the access.
Well,
And I
that's
think perhaps
possible.
the same would be
Very possible.
true for the work that you did, and it seems such a shame that such rich research struggles to
To be done
take
now.
place and
Yep.
be done.
Yeah.
But what you were describing in some ways sounds very contemporary, actually, as
Well,
well, in terms of the dynamic relations between all the players.
yeah, yeah.
So
That's
yeah,
what I would expect. Not a simple reproduction of the same pattern, but comparable dynamics, if you like.
yeah. I mean, the other thing that I think comes up a lot in Ockers and Disco's Maniacs is, a kind of debunking of sex role theory as well, which I don't think you've mentioned, but that's part of the whole analysis around hegemonic masculinity, isn't it?
Oh yes,
That
yeah.
actually, certain types of being or behavior are made culturally dominant, and that goes well beyond sex role theory. That's right, isn't it?
I think so. Sex role theory is not a trivial idea, but I had been working on role concepts as a theoretical tool beforehand, and I was had become convinced that role is only a halfway house, if you like, to an adequate social analysis, really, of anything. It was a way in which people in the 1970s recognized, by talking about sex roles, they could recognize that there was a social component in what men did as against what women did, or what came to be spoken of as masculinity and femininity. That was not just given in our hormones or our genetics, but there was a social component in it, and indeed a powerful social component in it. But it was only a halfway house to a good understanding of those social processes, because it really had very little grip on economic issues, on issues of power relations. It didn't tell us very much about violence, about gendered violence. Anything like sexual harassment was hard to understand in sex role terms. And it's most fundamentally, it didn't give us anything like an adequate grip on the multiplicity of gender patterns. Sex role theory always pretty much presumed that there was a male role here and a female role there. And they were social roles, all right, and they were somehow related to each other. But the only way you could get sort of plurality or diversity into the picture was by talking about deviance from the role. So when I first published a piece from my life history work, part of which involved interviews with gay men about their lives, and I thought, there's fascinating stuff here, and I wrote it up and I sent it to a mainstream sociology journal. And they said, look, this is all very well, and it's a nice piece of research, and we like it, but these people are deviants from the role. You've got to connect this argument with the sociology of deviance. So that was the professional response, if you see, from people who thought in conventional role terms, which we, of course, were trying to push beyond.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could say a bit more about that, actually, Raewyn, because obviously, around this time you're developing this concept of hegemonic masculinity, and this, as you say, has a huge impact really across the world in people's thinking, as well as your kind of broader theorizing around gender. And I was just wondering if you could say a little bit about what you think about that. Did you expect that work to have the impact that it's had, and how do you feel now about the analysis you did back then, and to what extent do you think it is still relevant to today's world?
Yeah, it was something of a well, one hopes for that, of course, always, but when it does happen, it's always a bit of a shock. And we knew that there was an interest in the field, so that the first sort of major paper about masculinity, not actually the first thing I wrote about masculinity, but the first major thinking through of of the field was a co-written paper that came out in 1985. And we knew we weren't the only people thinking about this issue, but it seemed that came out at a moment when a lot of people were beginning to think about that issue, and it was able to give them a bit of language, a bit of framework, a way of thinking about this. So that began to be translated into other languages, also reproduced in books of readings and so forth. And when just a couple of years later, I published a theoretical book on gender, which I thought, was a kind of, broad synthesis of the whole field. And that began to be reasonably widely read and cited. It wasn't at that time the full argument that was being noticed and cited. It was the passages about masculinity and the model, if you like, of forms of masculinity within a patriarchal society that was sketched there. But the rest of the argument, circulated more slowly, came through. It did downstream have an impact, but it wasn't the sudden burst of attention that very specific argument about masculinity, about there being multiple masculinities and a hierarchy of masculinities, and the two sort of being, something we need to think together. That seemed to be a valuable move for many people, many researchers. And then quite quickly, in various areas of practice, it was being picked up in counselling work. It was being picked up by teachers, especially teachers dealing with groups of boys who wanted some kind of guidance about what might be going on. It was picked up by other researchers, of course. It was picked up eventually by people working on issues of violence prevention. And that was really exciting to me, to see that, something that came out of, what in a somewhat derogatory sense is termed curiosity research. That's research that is not commissioned by a profit-making corporation to increase its pelf, but is designed by researchers in terms of what they think is the way to develop understanding in a given area. And to find not only does it develop understanding in that area in the sense of kicking off further and better research by other people, but also turns out to be practically useful to a range of practitioners in different areas. That was really quite exciting.
Yeah, well, I mean, kind of connected to that a little bit, I suppose. Going back to the Ockers and Discomaniacs work, like we noticed in the report that there's some things in there which are perhaps quite prescient to today about how some of the boys you were speaking to were talking about things like gender equality. Because, like, just to quote from it, on the one hand, some of the boys think women's liberation means women on top. What can it mean for them except the loss of masculinity? But on the other hand, you also said that a good many boys weren't threatened by the idea of equality for women. They just didn't see any particular way that it connected with them. And we just thought, perhaps does this still today sum up how lots of boys and men are responding to feminism and gender equality? And yeah, did you want to say anything about that, about what you're seeing today, about different ways in which boys and men are responding to kind of women's movements and for gender equality?
Yeah, I guess the big difference there is we're at a different historical moment. So when we were doing those interviews were being done in the late 1970s. And women's liberation was still a new thing at that time. I mean, it was still, a surge that seemed to be happening. Well, 10 years later, the surge, was still going on in some parts of the education system. In other parts, it had come to a halt. And not much later, there was a visible backlash. So I don't think you've got quite the same high emotion about the presence of feminism now. And you also have now more experienced opposition. So seemed in the 1980s to be strange and worrying, that what was then dubbed backlash, is now all very familiar. And, there are political movements which have been practicing what we might call a backlash politics quite deliberately, in an attempt to mobilise a certain kind of political base. I mean, this is now mutated in a way that what would have been, most sharply directed against feminists in the 1980s and 90s is now being more directed against gay, queer, and trans groups, as you see in the current kerfuffle in Texas with the attempt by the right-wing political regime there to criminalise care work by parents of trans kids. I mean, it's just astonishing concept. So if you like, the political moment changes, and we as well as seeing more or differently troubling forms of neoconservative mobilisation, we're also at a time when some of the gains of women's liberation can now more or less be taken for granted. So we find a lot of boys and men today saying gender equality, yeah, of course. I mean, what's the problem? And that wasn't quite the way that it was handled in the 70s when we were doing that first wave of interviews. It was more gender equality doesn't seem bad to me, but as you say, what's it got to do with me? I don't see how it relates to me. Perhaps many people have learned that. Sorry.
No, I was just thinking that, I mean, sometimes the surveys tend to suggest a sort of difference between the rhetorical commitment that men have to gender equality and change in actual practice. I mean, if you think about the behaviour of fathers, for example, very often they're saying, yes, I'm more involved, and then you ask the partner and you think, well, hold on, these stories aren't quite the same of what's happening in practice.
Yeah.
So
for sure. And I think it's there actually are changes in the division of labour, that we can find evidence for. A lot of fathers still are not pulling their weight, but there's a greater number of them now doing hands-on fathering than there was 50 years ago. Yes, as was Galileo said, yes, it does move. It might be moving slowly.
Yeah. I mean, another theme that we wanted to ask you about, which comes up in Masculinities, was that of the environment. And in the book, you explored several examples of how men engage in environmental politics and how they came to reject, if you like, mainstream masculinity and remake themselves by being more open, more honest, more vulnerable. But I think you also suggest that those kinds of individual responses, they don't amount to social transformation, and that the environmental movement tends to be non-gendered as well. I'm wondering how you see the climate movement, climate justice movement now, and whether these kinds of criticisms are still relevant in the environmental field.
No, I think it has changed. And I mean, we were doing those interviews, I think, before the emergence of green parties in the English-speaking world, at any rate, or in the very early days of them. And what we saw in those interviews, what we understood in interpreting those interviews, is a highly individualised response. And why we were doing those interviews was because the research project was looking at groups of men who were in situations that might be generating change in masculinity. And we did, in the context of the environmental movement, find an interview, a number of men who had encountered feminism in the movement had taken feminist positions seriously and had tried to rethink what it meant to be a man and how a man should live his life. And that was that was quite an impressive, thing to see happening, so to speak, before your eyes, or at least in the narrative of the interview. But what we were seeing also was a whole series of individual projects. We weren't seeing those different projects connecting with each other or having a visible arena in the environmental movement. But I think you would find that now rather more. You would find significant groups of men in the environmental movement who had, over a long period of time been thinking about gender issues, been reading feminist texts, had been debating these issues in and around the movement. So that, if you like, there's more of a collective project of change now. Now, how I don't actually have any data about how widespread this is. So I can't say that this is characteristic of the movement as a whole, but I think some of it is there now in a way that it wasn't a generation ago.
And so one of the things we do like to ask our guests on Now Men, Raewyn, is we do also like to explore the personal side of doing this work as well. And of course, over your career, you've kind of often made use of and advocated for the kind of life history method in your research. So I was just wondering how you would reflect on your own kind of personal life history. Obviously, that's quite a big question, but perhaps just for a few minutes, how do you feel about your own kind of personal journey as a sociologist, intellectual, as an activist?
Sure. Well, it's been a complex story, I would have to say, and the later part of my life has been fairly eventful. So yes, I've been, an academic all the time until my retirement, which is now about 7 years ago. My alleged retirement, I should say, because it comes to get you, whether you like it or not. I'm a widow. My life partner died some more than 20 years ago now, and that was a huge life upheaval, as you might expect. I'm a parent, and I've had the wonderful experience of being with a daughter growing up, growing into adulthood, carving her own directions in the world. All of that is splendid. And as you know, I've made a gender transition quite late in life, having thought about it for a very long time, and therefore having to think about it in retrospect too. So I suppose one of the things I would like to talk a bit about is transition, and in my case, life as a transsexual woman. And the implications of trans experience for men and for people working with men, I guess. And I guess one thing I would like to say is that the gender transition is in no sense a rejection of gender or of men or of women. It's not a sex change either. That's the common term that the media tend to use, but I don't think it's a good one. There's another language for talking about gender transitions. Often people talk about gender affirmation, and rather than gender change. And I think that's a good approach. It means you are affirming something that has been a long-standing reality. It's been there already. And what has been there, if I use some of my tools of trade to think about it as a sociologist of gender, transitions are about where you belong in the gender order. And usually where you have belonged in some significant way for a long time, So it has become a part of your life. There are contradictions in gender. Actually, in everybody's life, there are some contradictions. And in this case, one is dealing with fairly large contradictions about gender. That is a sense of having been in the wrong place in gender relations in the world at large, and eventually taking action to correct that. Now, many people take that action very much earlier. It happened in my course of life to happen relatively late. But whatever it is, it's a large issue, and it requires a great deal of work to construct a life after transition. It requires work and emotional attention from other people. It involves making demands on other people, which can be tough, can be very tough indeed. It's a process that will sometimes break up marriages or long-standing relationships, can lead to very tough family situations where a family is involved. In my case, I was wonderfully lucky because I got a lot of family support, and that has seen me through some bad times. I think it's important to for people involved in work with men, as it would be for people involved in work with women, to know something about the trans scene, because there's so much controversy and media talk about it, which is sometimes rather different from the reality. So the first thing is that the numbers are small, despite this huge, controversy about trans men, trans women, trans issues generally. The actual numbers are relatively small. So we're dealing with a small and potentially quite marginalised group. There's no single pattern for trans femininity or trans masculinity. I've talked to trans support groups, I think in about 8 or 9 countries around the world, including some countries in the developing world as well as the rich Anglophone countries. And the life situations are really incredibly different. And the local cultures of gender and of gender marginality are also very different. So it's a small but also very diverse world to be involved in. There are, of course, trans men as well as trans women. Trans women have got most of the publicity, most of the attention, and indeed, I think most of the abuse. But there are people who transition into masculinity and manhood, who have lives as significant and in various ways as tough, and have my sympathy and support completely. It's worth thinking about why trans men have got less attention than trans women. I won't try and answer that in 2 minutes, but it's a good problem to think about, which casts some interesting light on wider gender patterns, I think. What I can say is that despite the diversity, the different situations in poor countries and rich countries, the different cultural traditions involved, it's generally the case that the trans groups are under pressure, and many of them are very marginalised, living precarious lives. There's a high rate of gender-based violence against feminised trans women, trans groups, not all of whom, of course, are women. And there's a significant rate of premature death too. So this is sometimes life and death stories and issues. So it's a tough country to be involved in, and yet it's also a source of joy, affirmation, and realization, which of course is why people take these risks and move in this direction. So I have a few bits of advice to allies and friends, if you don't mind my exploiting this moment to speak about it. The first is don't think that trans men, trans women, or other trans groups are exotic. In most respects, the lives are ordinary, are actually have the same components as other people's lives, if somewhat differently arranged, and often more vulnerable to attacks from outside. But I wouldn't think of trans groups as villains. I wouldn't think of them as heroes, especially, but as sharing, most facets of lives with other groups. I've already said that there are contradictions and complexities in everybody's life, which are endemic in the gender order. And in that respect, it can be useful to think of trans lives as simply an extreme, one extreme is something that is common across all lives of tension, complexity, and contradiction in life. And the last thing I would want to say is that, despite the fact that transition is always, in an important sense, an individual matter, support does count. It really does matter to trans groups. And I think especially those who are in positions of precarity, who don't have the kind of cultural or economic resources that I have had in my life. Bear in mind that trans groups can face a lot of collective hostility from fundamentalist religions, from right-wing politicians, from dictatorships. These create needs, and basic solidarity for people in those kinds of situations with those kinds of needs really does matter, does make a difference. I've even with all my privileges, I've been immensely sustained by the support and goodwill that I've received in my life, and I'm deeply grateful for that.
Thank you for giving such a open, honest, and informative response to that question,
Okay,
Raewyn. Can I ask you one other thing, actually,
sure.
on the back of what you've been saying, which is about life as an older trans woman? Because I can imagine there's fewer of you, really.
This is absolutely right.
And
Let me tell you a story about that. I was talking once to a trans support group in Costa Rica. We were sitting in a coffee shack and talking about life and our lives and experiences and so on and so forth, doing the kind of exchange that you do in those circumstances. And somehow the question came up, how long did you expect to live? And the colleagues in Costa Rica talked about this in Spanish, of course, among themselves. I don't speak much Spanish, so I didn't follow the discussion. But eventually they told me their estimate, that they thought on the whole, trans women or members of feminized trans groups in that region could expect an average life of something like 32 years. But in the next door country, where there were death squads at work, they could expect maybe 28. And I suddenly thought, my God, I'm twice the age of anyone else here. I am much the oldest person well, not in the room, it was an outdoor shack, but around. And, that is a different story from my own, very different. So you're right, there are good, therefore, significant reasons. Of course, it's not all a matter of violence, it's also a matter of poverty, precarity, bad housing conditions, exposure to disease, and so on and so forth. And in a country like Australia, even in a country like Australia, a lot of young trans people are living precarious lives in poverty and exposed to not only violence but hazardous diseases. So there's a reason then why older trans people are not so common. It has, I guess, made me, a little, because I have resources and I have a lot of experience, I can perhaps deal with the ups and downs, the occasional situations of stress or abuse more readily. And I have, because of other aspects of my life, a network of connections, friendships, relations, and so on, which in that respect, my life is not so different from that of other older women. And I, don't regret growing old at all. I can't say I enjoy every aspect of it. The old joke that getting old is not a thing for sissies, but it also has its rewards. Among them, seeing the brilliant things being done by younger people coming along behind us.
That's very similar to, I think, what someone Lynn Seagal, said in her book. I don't know if
Yes.
you've read it, Out of Time, The Pleasures and Perils of Aging. She says similar things about valuing interdependence and treasuring connections with those who are younger and so on and so forth. It sounds rather similar.
Yes, well, nice. I haven't read that book, but I've read a good deal of Lynn's work and love it, and I will look for that book forthwith. Thank you.
Just for the benefit of listeners, Lynn wrote what I think is one of the best books about masculinity as well, Changing Masculinities, Changing Men. So perhaps we'll give a plug for that.
Sure.
But I think we're probably coming to the end of our time, but we realised when we were looking on your website and your background and everything that you also like to write poetry, and maybe quite a lot of people wouldn't know that, but we thought it might be quite nice to offer you the opportunity to end with a poem. And I don't know, I think you've chosen one, but yes. I don't know if you want to say anything about it or whether you just want to read it. Over to you.
Well, yeah, I will say that I've been writing poetry off and on throughout my life, and even published it a little. And you will find a selection of some of the more relatively recent ones on my website. The one that I will read is a kind of poem that comes out of everyday life, and it reflects on a moment in everyday life. In this case, the moment when the council truck comes around to collect the garbage. In this case, the green waste, and that's the title of the poem, Green Waste. Each second Monday, the council collects green waste from bins in the back lane. I rarely remember which week is the one. And my waste is mostly cockroach brown or the grey of dead twigs, so I quickly add, to encourage them, a layer of soft weeds that are still fresh. Green, yes, but is it waste? Can I trust this cost-cutting council to point its dump truck at a compost heap? I want my green wealth to feed new green, and not the black waste of oil or the red waste of war.
Thanks so much, Raewyn. What a great poem to end with. I'm sure all of us know that moment with the dumper truck coming past in the mornings as well, and the relationship with the council, and and your last couple of lines there. Perhaps take us back to the start of this conversation about where we were with Ukraine. Anyway, thank you so much for talking to us today. It's been an absolute pleasure for both of us.
Yes. Yeah, and thank you for all of the work you do, which is such an inspiration to us and many other people across the world. So.
Yeah.
Well, thank you
so much.
Glad to do it. Take care.
Thank you.
Well, that was a very wide-ranging interview with Raewyn, wasn't it, Stephen? Just for the benefit of listeners, by the way, if you could hear some noise in the background, that was actually Australian wildlife. The crickets, I think, were out in the evening. So just to clear that one up before we go any further. But Stephen, what did you think?
Yeah, well, first of all, I love the sound of Australian wildlife in the background there, but also, yeah, I just thought it was an incredibly kind of fascinating and powerful conversation, really, and it's amazing to hear about the huge wealth of work that Raewyn's done, and actually, all of the really interesting, nuanced, in-depth research which she's done, which her very influential theories are built upon. I think that's really powerful, and I suppose it just leads me to think, I want to engage more with all of the range of work that she's done on different issues, and I can highly recommend all of our listeners to do the same because not only has she written this really amazing groundbreaking stuff about gender and masculinities, but she's also done a lot of work around what she calls southern theory, for example, which feels ever more topical at the moment as we're talking more and more about things like decolonizing the curriculum and things like that. And she's also done some great and kind of really positive and inspiring work about what's going on in universities and all of the bad things that have been happening in terms of privatization and cuts and casualization, which are highly relevant again at the moment because here in the UK, of course, we have been having a strike at universities. Lots of us have been on strike in recent weeks. But she's actually written a great book recently about what would a good university look like and how can we create that. So I can again definitely recommend people to check that out. What did you think, Sandy?
Yeah, well, just to build on the point you just made there, really, and going back to the start of our conversation with Raewyn, she was interesting about Ukraine and about Putin and the way that it's presented in our media as if it's just a sort of individual story about Putin, equating him with the strong man and kind of divorcing him from the groups and institutions around him. But actually, as she made clear, and this seems to be a sort of key, it's a key element of her work. It's about the collective. It's about social, societal issues as well, and the institutions that are involved. And I just thought that was an interesting and useful answer. We've all seen those media images of Putin and the big table, and the Western leaders at the other end of the table, or others close by, and so on and so forth. And actually, yes, that kind of matters in terms of presentation, but it's far from being the whole story of what's going on, actually. So I thought that was very relevant. The other thing I just thought would be worth picking up on was that last segment there about being a trans woman. That was very powerful, very honest, very open. We don't hear very much about that issue, and I just thought it was incredibly honest of her to talk about it, really. The other thing to mention there was her answer in relation to old age as well, and I thought it was quite nice, the correspondence, if you like, between what Lynn Seagal has written about being an older woman and what Raewyn was saying, and I certainly got a sense of someone who was still engaged, active, interested, funny, joyous, and so on and so forth. So she clearly is enjoying her old age.
Yeah, I agree. I really, that was really nice to hear, wasn't it? But yeah, and I think what you were saying as well about Putin and Russia and the terrible situation in Ukraine currently, I think that took us, like her poem actually, at the end took us back to the first question, didn't it? And about this book, Boys in Zinc. And I suppose the title actually kind of partly refers, doesn't it, to how during the Afghanistan war, all of these kind of Russian soldiers were coming back in these zinc coffins. And you do think, you just can't help but think about the massive, horrifying human cost of the war that's going on in Ukraine currently, and all of the Ukrainian people who are just suffering massively and dying, civilians in many cases, but also, of course, there'll be these many Russian soldiers, many of them incredibly young men going back home in coffins, and you just wonder, might that instigate some questioning of the regime in Russia? I mean, we have seen those really inspiring, incredibly brave protests as well.
The other point about it is, in a way, that title, Boys in Zinc, is also an ironic comment on sort of Stalinist Men of Steel, presentation of masculinity, an idealized masculinity, which is about strongman and so forth.
But yeah, I think for now that's the end of the podcast. So we hopefully will be speaking to you again soon. But for now, thank you so much, everybody, for listening. Don't forget to contact us at nowandmen@gmail.com if you've got any questions or feedback, and do subscribe and share us with your friends. But for now, take care and speak to you again soon.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
Bye.